This podcast episode was made possible in part with support from Sacred Rights, a project funded by the Henry Luce Foundation and the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation and hosted by Northeastern University. Sacred Rights is a project that supports public scholarship on religion and provides resources and networks for scholars of religion committed to translating the significance of their research to a broader audience. I recommend you learn more about Sacred Rights on their website at sacred-rights.org or find Sacred Rights on Twitter at sacred_rights. Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden, and this is a podcast where, since 2017, I discuss all things religion with a variety of fantastic scholars, experts, authors, and educators. On this episode, Dr. Jeannie Sellick and I discuss her area of expertise, constructions of gender and sexuality in the religious traditions of the ancient and late antique Mediterranean, with a particular focus on queer masculinities. We discuss her dissertation, titled The Strongest Seed, Jerome's Fashioning of an Ascetic Masculinity in Late Antiquity, before moving into her essay, Virgin Acts, Blinding, Castration, and the Violence of Male Chastity, which discusses the Apocryphal Acts of John. Just a quick content warning, the piece goes through some especially violent and graphic stories and includes but is not limited to examples of mutilation, sexual assault, murder, and more. And we discuss all of these topics. Jeannie Sellick is a recent graduate of the University of Virginia's Religious Studies Ph.D. program and is now a postdoctoral fellow. You can find her on Twitter at @theatheistnun. Thank you so much for listening. Enjoy. Dr. Jeannie Sellick, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Hi, good to be here.
I'm delighted that you're with me to have this wonderful conversation about your work. I'm wondering if you can just spend a moment and introduce yourself a little bit to the audience so they know who you are and what you do.
Hi, I am Jeannie Sellick. I am a baby doctor, so I just defended a little under a year ago, working as a visiting professor up at Bowdoin College right now. In terms of what I work on, I do largely gender and sexuality in ancient Christianity, but my real sort of focus is on the intersection of masculinity and sexuality in, Christian ascetic circles, but that also bleeds into non-ascetic circles, and weirdly enough, bleeds into now very much so. Yeah, I teach a lot, everything from Hebrew Bible to Jesus in film and sex and gender in early Christianity.
Awesome. Well, Jeannie, I have a kind of an odd starting point for us here today. One of my favorite things about the Sacred Rights website that I'm talking to everybody on the cohort for this series, and I loved your bio because it's so enthusiastic about your hobbies, one of which is buffalo wings. And being that I live in Buffalo and I'm surrounded by the cultural, the big tent of wing culture here in Buffalo. I'm wondering if you can just share your affinity for buffalo wings and your maybe some recipe ideas for those out there, because I loved seeing that. And I wanted to make the Buffalo connection.
Yeah, so I've always loved since I was a kid, on for a child to buffalo wings, and I used to spend an embarrassing amount of money at Buffalo Wild Wings, which I still do sometimes. But I got an air fryer a year ago for Christmas, which has saved me so much money, right? For me, it's not avocados, it's buffalo wings, and this is how I'm gonna buy a house maybe. So what I do is with the air fryer is it's really, really simple, but I make my own breading. Well, so first of all, I brine them in a little bit of salt for up to 2 hours, but usually 30 minutes to 45 minutes. I make my mixture of it's just flour, some salt, some garlic powder, and then cayenne pepper to make the breading spicy. And then what do I do? So I do it on 380 for 20 minutes and then 400 for 6 minutes to give it that extra crisp. I've tried making like my own buffalo sauce, but it never turns out as well as like store-bought. But I still buy the Buffalo Wild Wings, the Thai curry
Yeah.
it's so good. But that's my recipe. I'm always looking for, ways to perfect it. And maybe someday I'll make my own sauce.
One of the recommendations that I would give to you is there's a book called Buffalo Everything, A Guide to Eating in the Nickel City, written by Arthur Bovino, who I actually interviewed on my religion podcast one time talking about food in Buffalo, purely just for fun because of I had to know. So I did a really off-brand episode one time talking about only Buffalo food. So definitely check that out. I think that you'll really love it.
Oh yeah, I will love that. Yeah.
Fabulous. So let's turn to the topic at hand here. Now that we've got our Buffalo connection out of the way, I want to know a little bit about your academic backstory, a little bit about the path that led you into your areas of interest in your profession. Kind of take me through the journey of getting you to where you are today.
Yeah. So I always say that I got into religion and religious studies sort of through the back door, because like I was not really raised religious. I mean, the most we did was like we watched Jesus Christ Superstar like every Easter. So that was like my starting point. But like I was like, oh, I'm not really into religion. And I did a lot of work on ancient gender and women and queerness. But when I went to Oxford for my master's, which is like where sort of theology and religious studies are like very similar. It's not like here where you kind of have this divide. In the UK, theology basically is how we do religious studies in the US. And my advisor was like, if you want to do some like queer gender stuff, like, why don't you look at early Christianity? Look at the Bible. And I was like, okay, sure, like whatever. I didn't believe him. And then I looked and I was like, holy shit. I mean, if I'm allowed to, but like, holy shit, this is awesome and crazy and wacky and so cool. And so from there, I started really getting into like early Christian asceticism, a lot of work on virginity. And eventually, I pivoted to thinking not just about sort of female virginity, which is kind of like the shiny coin of early Christianity. And I was like, how are we talking about the dudes? Like, how are we talking about men and their relationship to sexuality and virginity and how that shapes them? And I have like never looked back. I think it's I'm biased, but it's the most fun.
Whenever I was reading some of your work, I was like, this is unlike anything I've ever talked about on this podcast before, which is so exciting to come across, almost 300 episodes into making this thing. I do want to know a little bit about the major objectives of your dissertation. You defended a year ago. You said it's called The Strongest Seed, Jerome's Fashioning of an Ascetic Masculinity in Late Antiquity. Tell me a little bit about this project and how it came together and like what you're hoping to convey with the dissertation project.
So the project originally, I remember when I proposed, I was like, I want to do just like male virginity writ large. And everyone on the committee was like, no, you like need to finish, like you need to do something. So we picked as a corpus Jerome. And I picked Jerome because as like, since my master's, I've been really into, and I can't really describe why, the kind of like the magnificent bastards of the ancient world, so these kind of like these church fathers who really like, they write with so much confidence about everything that they do, and they write tons and tons and tons, and they're kind of jerks. I mean, yeah, like Jerome especially, like he kind of knows and he owns that he's sort of a jerk. But I got really into Jerome because I had been doing all this work on ideas about female sexuality and marriage. And I got really into this controversy called the Jovinian controversy, which is essentially a kind of battle royale between Jerome and this guy Jovinian about whether or not married women and virgin women go to like the same rank of heaven. Are they equals? And when I was looking at Jerome's work, one thing I noticed in sort of his battles against Jovinian was he does talk a lot about male virginity, not in the same way, but he sort of, again, like sneaks it in through the back door. And so my dissertation was really an effort to initially explore how male sexuality and virginity shows up in Jerome's corpus. And what I ended up sort of finding in the project was that, he adopts and appropriates, this is not super shocking, but he appropriates kind of ideas of masculinity, just plucks them from Greco-Roman world. He's not reinventing the wheel. He's just sort of plucking terms and ideas and qualities and like putting them on male monks, male clerics, male ascetics in general. And so one of the things that I really wanted to get out of the project, chiefly was, especially with Jerome, there is so much work, and it's great work on how he treats sort of the female virgin body. But I was like, let's take a moment to sort of turn the tables a little bit and think about how is the male sexual body being understood by one of these sort of, the king of the virgins from the ancient world.
What were some of the feedback like from your dissertation committee on, learning about this topic? I'd imagine it's something that maybe was surprising to people out there, like they were working with you on this in a professional aspect. What was that feedback like?
My favorite piece of feedback from the defense was I had one woman, Ivana Petrovich, who's a classicist, and she just kind of laughed and was like, this is so confusing, but I think it's meant to be confusing. And I'm like, yes, because some of what you'll find is like a lot of these church fathers, a lot of writers in general, right, who their corpus is like letters or it's just like random treatises. You're not necessarily creating a kind of systematic understanding of like, this is what it means to be a male virgin. Instead, you're getting a lot of sort of putting out fires. And so a lot of contradictions, a lot of confusions. For Jerome specifically, I think for a lot of the feedback was interested in sort of the queerness in how Jerome depicts men. And that was something that surprised me as well. This kind of like queering of the male body of the male virgin was something that was, it maybe shouldn't have been that surprising. Like medievalists are like, yeah, no shit. But for me, I was like, whoa.
You have referred to several things that I think are going to come out really nice in this conversation that we're about to have. Like you mentioned queerness, and you mentioned some virginity and chastity and some details around this. And whenever I got in touch with you for the first time, you sent me a piece called Virgin Acts, Blinding, Castration, and the Violence of Male Chastity. And this is one of the most interesting things. I was gripped. And I'm wondering if you can tell me a little bit about the origin of this piece and maybe a little bit about the context of the piece within the Bible. And you can take those questions in either order that you want.
Totally. So I know we're not supposed to say like, I love this question, but I do love this question because I remember the exact like genesis of this piece. And so when I was at NAPS, or like the Oxford Patristics, that's where I was in like a pub, and I was sitting with my colleague, and I had just given this paper on, big shocker here, Jerome and the Jovinian controversy. And I gave a lot of, I gave a lot of time in that paper to thinking about how Jerome is shaping the figure of John. And because of my PhD program, one of my instructors was Janet Spittler, who is like, does a lot of work on the Acts of John. I, of course, had spent a lot of time with the Acts of John. And so I was just sitting there in this pub, and I was really just thinking about the figure of John and where Jerome is kind of, how he's conceptualizing John, where all of these ideas about John come from. And I was like, oh my God, I need to just go to the Acts of John and like think about where this kind of stuff is showing up. How is John being conceptualized in sort of early apocryphal literature and not just in sort of like conversations from later church fathers. And so right then and there, I sort of had this idea about John as this kind of like queer figure who's able to sort of transgress different sort of gendered boundaries. John as an apostle is very kind of, he's unique. He's one of the only apostles who's not martyred. Instead, in the Acts of John, he just like lays down in a grave and he's like, bye, I'm going to die now. And it's like, it's this kind of unique aspect to John. And so Virgin Acts, this piece came from really thinking about how is John this unique figure in the Acts of John that we see kind of reflected in other later sort of patristic and then medieval sources about John. So that was sort of the genesis of this. And then, as I read more and more, I'm like, wow, there's a lot of like sexualized violence against the male body, which was something that was unique to me in reading, especially in the Apocryphal Acts of the Apostles. Yeah.
You've got this term in here that metastasis, is that correct?
I think so. I think so. I say I switch between metastasis and
metastasis.
I'm sure if I have any Greek professors out there, their ears are bleeding, but I do metastasis because I have a lot of friends in STEM and they're like metastasize. But so yeah, the metastasis or metastasis.
Tell me a little bit about that section, and because I think it's going to be really important for what we get into next.
So just like I said, John is one of the few apostles in the, in the Christian tradition who doesn't get martyred. He doesn't get killed by the state. And John, he lives this long life. And finally, he's like, okay, it's time to go. He has his disciples go out and dig a grave. Then he lays down in the grave. He's like, okay, goodbye, everyone. I'm going. Farewell. But as he's lying down, he does like this final deathbed plea to Jesus for his salvation. And this for me is another aspect of the story that is striking. He's not like, oh, I converted a lot of people. I did a lot of healings, like congrats to me. Instead, he's like, yo, Jesus, I wanted to get married 3 times and I didn't. You stopped me. And now I'm coming to you as a virgin. Like my love for you is undefiled and is stainless. And so please, for that reason, give me salvation. And I was like, oh my God, this is wild.
In this piece that you talk about, it's in the title too, blinding, castration, and the violence of male chastity. And so I want to talk about these aspects of sexual violence that are here. So we have so many examples. We have affairs and patricide and genital mutilation and attempted necrophilia and blinding. Tell me about Jesus's views of sexual violence and bodily maiming first, and then we'll get into what you write about in the piece.
Yeah. So one of sort of the big moments of Jesus talking about, sin and the body and bodily mutilation is in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 9. And all of this, I should say, everything I'm about to say is completely indebted to the work of Candida Moss, who directed me to her work on sort of therapeutic amputation and auto castration is sort of a something of that. But in Mark 9, we have, that's that famous passage of Jesus being like, if like your left hand causes you to sin, like chop it off. If like your eyeball looks and like is tempted, pluck it out. This sense from it where Jesus is like, like your body, if it's causing you to stumble, causing you to sin, get rid of the thing that's problematic. A lot of, ancient interpreters, and of course, I think I would bet money most 99.9% of modern interpreters of this passage take it as sort of, metaphorical. But we do know that some ancient Christians did take this literally. I mean, read this passage literally.
Got it. Okay. So let's talk about some of these examples. So we have the first story here involving affairs and patricide and genital mutilation. Tell me a little bit about the backstory within this piece and what happens.
Yeah. So this is the first one. This is the castration piece. You have this unnamed young man in Ephesus who John runs into, and the man is like running with a sickle. And John's like, hey, what happened? And so we get this whole monologue from this young man who's like, I was having an affair with a married woman. My dad was like, son, don't do this. Dad finds out about the affair. The son kicks him to death because he's upset. Then he runs off and is going to his mistress's house where he's going to plan to kill his mistress's wife or husband. Sorry, that would have been a whole nother thing. His mistress's husband and then himself. So, we've got like a quadruple murder suicide based on one affair here. And John finds him as he's going to do this and is like, hey, whoa, pump the brakes. Why don't I resurrect your dad? And then you just don't talk to that woman anymore. Just like forget her. Don't think about it. And so he's like, great. Dad is resurrected. All thing you think is good. But the son is so compelled by seeing his father resurrected that he runs over to his mistress's house, chops off his genitals with the sickle and throws them at her. And he's super proud of this. He goes back to John. He's like, hey, look. He's like, hey, look what I did. Aren't you so proud? And John is just like, what the hell, dude? Like, no, don't, like, you shouldn't have done that. And I find this to be a really interesting scenario, especially given, what we just talked about with Jesus's words in Mark 9, where, like, if you're reading, the canonical Gospel of Mark, you're like, oh, well, like, doesn't Jesus, like, he says, like, if this causes you to sin, like, cut it off. And that's what this guy does. But John very much issues a corrective here, that I still, to this day, I find it, every time I read this, I find that so odd myself. And so the best thing that I can sort of come up with in thinking through this, and I say this in the piece, is that, it's possible what's going on here in the piece is that you're having sort of the invention of this as taboo for Christians. Potentially, this is something Christians are understanding literally, and maybe this is sort of an attempt at an intervention for that, being like, hey, don't like castrate yourself. Instead, think about like, the springs that are within you that want to sin, but don't castrate yourself.
Yeah, something that really jumped out at me when I was reading this story was the way that this woman in the story gets this severed body part thrown at her, and how absolutely horrific and traumatizing of an experience that something like that would be. And, there's also this element of like blaming the woman in a lot of the different stories that you write in this piece. It just comments a little bit on that, about like having this severed body part thrown at you. And then also the element of blame that goes into women in these stories.
Yeah. So the idea of like women as the stumbling blocks in early Christian literature is so omnipresent. I mean, it's kind of omnipresent now too, but this idea that like woman exists in proximity to man is tempted, she gets a severed penis thrown at her. It's bonkers. This is something that's so common in early Christian literature that sometimes it's a thing that I find myself, it's really easy to become desensitized to it. So it's really nice to hear you sort of comment on like how traumatic of a thing that would be for this unnamed adulteress, quote unquote adulteress, right? Because she's not given a name, and she's never offered in the text the opportunity to convert. So this man who like kills his father is going to kill her. He gets this like in the text, this wonderful opportunity to be forgiven and to convert. And then we don't hear anything about what happens to her. She's not afforded the same kind of opportunities. And, Christianity, early Christian literature has all of these stories that really do have this kind of theme of women dying and men living because of their deaths. So like women die, women get, mutilated, women get injured, women get assaulted, and then suddenly that is kind of the catalyst for a man becoming this enlightened celibate Christian. And very often we don't hear a lot about what happens to these women after. In the Acts of John, we do have an example where we do know what happens to a woman later, but this is really such a common thing across these texts, these early Christian texts.
Yeah, it's really fascinating for me to think about like the gender aspect and who gets to speak and who gets to be saved and converted and who doesn't and why. Fascinating stuff. Let's up the ante here a little bit. The next one is particularly horrific. There is an example of attempted necrophilia where a man is basically throwing himself at a woman in the Bible, and she denies him. And then when she dies, he attempts to rape her corpse. And I'm wondering if you can just give me a little bit more detail on this story here, because you're going to say it a lot more eloquently than I am, I'm sure.
Yeah, this is one of the hardest ones. So you have this woman named Drusiana, and we get this kind of insider info as readers that Drusiana, she's in the Apostle John's posse. She's essentially a disciple of John. And we get some of her backstory in that when John meets her, she used to be married. It was very contentious, but by the time we meet her in the Acts of John, at least what we have left, she and her former husband, Andronicus, they are just kind of living as brother and sister, living celibately. So it's worked out. But then this new man comes into the mix, this man named Callimachus. And like you said, Callimachus, he immediately sort of falls in love with Drusiana. She tells him repeatedly, like, hey, no, I'm celibate. I've been through this song and dance before. I'm not interested. And she gets so stressed about this, I guess, that she actually dies. She just dies. And Callimachus is just so, it's in the text, he's so drawn to her because of, he's the devil's emissary, that he goes to try to rape her corpse. He is thwarted at kind of the last minute by a giant snake that is divinely sent. And he temporarily dies. It's a little unclear, but he temporarily dies until the next morning when we have John returns to sort of Drusiana's tomb. He sees what's happened, and then they, resurrect Callimachus. They resurrect this rapist and are like, hey, what happened? And apparently one thing that is said to Callimachus is die so that you may live. So he's killed before raping the corpse so that he can be resurrected as a Christian. And Drusiana does herself get resurrected after Callimachus, but then she's expected to, all's well that ends well, live sort of in this, this celibate posse with John and Andronicus and Callimachus, as if, I guess, nothing had happened.
Yeah.
And sort of continue on.
Yeah, the saving and the conversion of the attempted rapist and necrophiliac was a very, it's very wild to wrap your brain around for her just to be like, okay, well, I guess now he's just like my spiritual equal, even though I have been completely victimized. I am the victim here. And it's just never really addressed. And like what you said earlier about women as stumbling blocks, it's just completely normal in these stories. And I mean, obviously we can see that the women are victims of extraordinarily horrible acts, and then they're just expected to live alongside those that have wronged them. I'm sure that you can see maybe some modern day equivalents of what this type of thing has turned into over the past several centuries. Do you have any modern day thoughts about what some of the messages within this piece are actually saying, and how we can connect that to now and here and now and today?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of these things that's so, I wish it were less relevant. Is sometimes I wish that this work were less relatable to our current moment, because I think we're always hearing especially sort of in modern churches, of contexts in which, women are assaulted or harassed and sort of just meant to forgive, meant to live alongside their abusers. We hear about this a lot, be it something like, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the podcast name, the one about the Mars Hill. Mars Hill stuff. I haven't watched the Hillsong documentary yet, but I think that it includes some of that. Even just I have such a love-hate relationship with Twitter, but Twitter is one of sort of a really amazing in a bad way nexus to sort of see how this operates. A few weeks ago, it's getting to be summer. There's again this discourse about what should Christian women or women in general wear in the summer. And of course now, on Twitter, again, we have all these alpha, someone, alpha, he, alpha, who, whatever.
Sure. Yeah.
And they're like, oh, don't wear a short skirt because you're going to tempt him. But my favorite thing, though, was another woman did a quote tweet of one of these, and she quoted actually from Jesus in Mark 9, which is just oh, is your eye causing you to sin? Pluck it out. And so it's funny the ways in which some of these things from antiquity continue to be really influential in kind of, I would say rad trad discourse, radical traditional Christian discourse. But the other ways in which other things have been ignored or overlooked or interpreted away. And so I think about always when I read this kind of stuff about conversations about how women dress or how femme people dress, and the blame that gets put on you when you dress a certain way and then someone assaults you or harasses you.
I'm just thinking about your own life and your personal well-being and your own mental health with regards to just being a person in the world today. Does studying stuff like this ever, do you carry it with you in a way that other professions that don't read about sexual violence and things like that, especially when it comes to religion, does that affect you at all? Do you carry this work with you emotionally, in your normal life?
I do and I don't. In one sense, I'm really privileged by the fact that everyone I study is long dead. And so it's really sometimes easy to create this super big distance and think of, these stories as, either, fictional or with elements of nonfiction. It's easy to think of these as characters in a story sometimes. And that kind of, distance is, like I said, a really great privilege. I've learned especially about this in sacred rites, being in a cohort of people who do things that are much more modern. At the same time, it is kind of impossible not to take some of it with you and not to sometimes read some of these ancient texts and get a little salty, which probably isn't a strong enough word, but get a little salty about like, I am like a queer lady who is living in 2023. Why is my life, like my rights, why are they being so shaped by some of this? But that's also why I study this too. I also, like, not to throw this up, but I have a really good therapist. So it is and it isn't. I would say, the distance does help, but also sometimes I have to really check myself, because even though there is this distance, the things being depicted it's very real, it's very graphic, it's very impactful to read. So basically all my scholarship has a giant content warning attached to it.
So there is one more example that was really fascinating because it involves John being blinded by Jesus because John had sexual desire beyond being exclusive to Jesus. This was a very fascinating example that you wrote about involving man-on-man violence. You had a really solid discussion on the Bride of Christ. And then you also had a really fascinating discussion on queerness within this particular example. Walk me through this one, because it's really interesting stuff.
Yeah. So like I had said earlier, right, this scene is John's deathbed, and we get this detailed plea for salvation that outlines his kind of trajectory to coming to his deathbed as a virgin. And by this point, or by sort of the late 2nd century, early 3rd century, you do have conglomerating around the figure of John, this idea that he is A, the author of the Gospel of John, of the canonical Gospel of John, and that B, he's the beloved disciple in the Gospel of John. And so I think to a certain extent what you have here is sort of an effort to kind of make sense of why John is the beloved disciple, why he has this special relationship with Jesus where he gets to lay on his chest. I should say, though, in the canonical Gospel of John, you do not get an indication that either John or the beloved disciple are a lifelong virgin. That's never in the canonical Gospels, the canonical text. But you get that argument kind of being made here in the Acts of John. And what's unique about it, though, not just unique, but sort of disturbing about it, is this kind of violent undercurrent here that they're presenting. You get this idea, because I had heard these stories, right, that, John is a lifelong virgin, ooh la la, that's why he's close to Jesus. But it's here where you get this idea that, like, that's not John's choice. This is something that he is kind of being forced into by Jesus. Tries to get married 3 times. Jesus won't let him, and finally blinds him. And that's kind of the end of the pushback. I find this scene sometimes kind of difficult to talk about because it's like so many intersecting issues. So one, we have the kind of the intense sort of sexual violence that's underlying this whole scene. Another thing is we have the definite sort of queerness, the Bride of Christ thing going on in here. Now, I am not the first and I will not be the last to be like, this scene is hella queer, right? I mean, like, it's really dripping with this kind of queerness here, because you have this idea, even if there's no actual kind of sexual interaction between John and Jesus, this idea that John is exclusively sexually Jesus's. And so no matter kind of how you parse it, like I say, the most straightforward reading of this is very queer. And what we have here too is, you mentioned the brides of Christ. We have here John sort of being walked up to the line of being a bride of Christ. He's never named that, but it's like, to me at least, and I think to many readers, it's pretty clear that that's sort of what they're circling, is this idea of John as a bride of Christ.
So if people want to read stuff like this, where would they go if they're looking to, find some texts that, like, if they want to learn more about these stories that you're saying, where do we go and find these things?
Yeah, so I would 100%, if you are interested in queer traditions and sort of this like more like wacky stuff, look at apocryphal literature. So look at things that are outside of the Christian canon. One of the places that you can find a lot of information on this stuff is from the North American Society for like the Study of Christian Apocryphal Literature, NASCAL. They have a website that has a lot of details on not just sort of the existence of these apocryphal stories, but will also link you to open access translations. You will also get information about the textual tradition, because like the textual tradition of even the Acts of John is wild. It's really kind of like more like a comic book than it is a stable sort of textual tradition. You can also follow me on Twitter if you want to hear more. There is a lot of this out there, and there are people who are always doing cool work on apocryphal stuff. I think NASCAL is a really great resource if you want to get started thinking about Apocrypha.
Very cool. Let's talk about something you've been up to recently. I know you're part of the 2023 Sacred Rites cohort, and you are doing the trainings and going through that with a wonderful group of people, all of whom I am getting to meet and have wonderful conversations with. Tell me a little bit about your experience so far and why you think it's really important to do trainings for being a public-facing scholar.
I'll start with the why it's important. So I've always been really interested in public facing scholarship. I like assigning it. I like the idea of writing it, but it's terrifying, right? Because you really are putting yourself out there. And depending on what you work on, it can be more or less terrifying. Obviously, as we've just talked about what I work on, it can be hairy, it can be sticky. And one thing that Sacred Rites has really helped me with is really thinking through the stakes of public scholarship. So the stakes, not just for me, but of people from, different kinds of communities that are more vulnerable on public forums. And so Sacred Rites has been really helpful in that respect. It's been also really helpful, I think, in cultivating a kind of confidence that like this is work that you can do and almost everyone can do. It just takes some hand-holding a little bit to think about how to transfer your voice from like writing an academic paper to presenting something in sort of a more public voice.
You write about very old topics, as you mentioned earlier. Tell me a little bit about maybe some of the challenges of, translating that work for the modern reader who isn't involved in religious studies. What are your thoughts on that?
So one of the biggest challenges on doing this kind of work is I feel like it's a lot. Sometimes it can feel like you're doing a lot of world building. Like I have to do a lot of world building to understand antiquity, like at least a little bit, for this to really sing, for it to really make sense. One of the privileges though I also have about my work is, for better or for worse, people tend to be really into Christianity and the Bible. A lot of times you will find people who think they know a lot about the Bible. Sometimes they do. Very often they do not know a lot about the Bible or ancient Christianity. And so another issue that I have with this is having to kind of deconstruct some of the ideas around how to read biblical texts and how to read non-biblical texts. So, for example, one of the things that I'm always pushing against is, even I'm saying here we have biblical canon and we have Apocrypha. And sometimes it's like, oh, these things are so different. And they're like, one is revered and like true, and the other is like sneaky and fan fiction-y and off to the side. And that just doesn't really reflect the reality of ancient Christianity or sort of, ancient literature in general. We know that things like the Acts of John, even if they're not in the Bible, are incredibly influential in shaping how early Christians and how Christians now understand their own sources. I mean, John is one of our best examples of this, right? Like not everyone, but like everyone thinks, would be like, oh yeah, John's the beloved disciple, duh. But that's not inherent in the canonical Gospel of John. You have to go to apocryphal sources to get that connection made explicitly. Yeah, you do. It's a lot of like both deconstruction and then rebuilding of the world. And a lot of people think it's so cool. And I agree, it's the coolest thing ever.
That's awesome. And you mentioned a little bit about the risks, a little bit about doing these kinds of things. People are very passionate about this topic. I'd imagine that it can get quite argumentative. Do you have any thoughts on like what Sacred Rites is doing with regards to addressing the risks and the rewards and the responsibilities of doing this kind of work? Where do you see yourself within that?
Yeah, so they do a really good job of taking us through like almost everything that we do. We have to think about, or we don't have to, but we get to think about risks, rewards, and responsibilities. And for me, having Sacred Rites put that framework in my mind is really helpful, because I tend to be this person who's like, put it all out there. Like, let me share everything about myself. I am a millennial. Why would I not share every single thing about myself and my scholarship? Here's my social security number, but it has really helped temper my desire to be like, every thought in my head needs to be in the world. Sometimes the risks really do outweigh the, rewards or responsibilities. And sometimes the responsibilities really outweigh the rewards. Like, you can do a badass piece on like certain aspects of early Christianity that would in the end be not super helpful for, I would say, our world. And so it's really thinking through, what am I producing? What do I want it to do? And what's the risk to me and my community?
Wonderful. What are you enjoying being a part of the cohort? What's been the collaborative aspect like? And are you enjoying being, surrounded by other people with their own totally different fields sometimes? And what are you learning in that group setting?
It's been really nice. I am learning that like people, this is a very selfish thing. People are really into early Christianity. When I say that, they're like, ooh, that's wild, because it is. It's like, for a lot of people, it's the gateway drug. But I also have been learning a lot about just how many people out there want to support your work, my work, everyone's work. The sort of community that we've created in our cohort for Sacred Rites has been really helpful in terms of, finding people to read proposals, finding people to read work. And it's especially nice for me because I think ancient folks, we can get so caught in our own little world. And so it's really nice for me to give work to someone who does more modern things, to be like, okay, where does this resonate? What kind of like baseline information do I need to give you for this to make sense? Because sometimes, if you're not part of the world, it can be a little confusing as to like what's even going on.
Sure. What's next for you? What are you working on? What are you hoping to get out there in the next couple of years?
Yeah, I have 3 articles that I am hoping to get out there very soon, all sort of surrounding, big shocker here, Jerome, the Acts of John, and male virginity. I should say that if you are interested in the piece that I talked about today, I should have led with this. It has been published in a very wonderful collection called, maybe edit out my pause.
I'm gonna.
Okay, I'm called. Let's get it right. Sex, Violence, and Early Christian Texts. It came out last year, and it's a collection of really wonderful essays from scholars of early Christianity. And it was edited by Christy Cobb and Eric Van Den Eichel, who I think has appeared on this podcast before.
Yes, Eric has been here before.
Yeah, and so I would highly recommend, check it out from the library. Buy it if you can, get your school to buy it for you. It is a great collection of essays about similar topics, all really good. For me, yeah, I'm just working on getting some articles out here about John and Jerome and male virgins, and maybe at some point a book. I'm working on that proposal as well. You finish the dissertation and you rest for like a month, and then it's like, okay, there is another big project I have to finish. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, Dr. Jeannie Sellick, I have loved learning about your work. This extraordinarily violent imagery within this piece is really important and interesting to talk about on the show. So I'm really glad that we could have such a fascinating and engaging conversation. I loved the piece. And so I do think that people should check out. I'm going to put a link to the collection in the show notes. So if people want to actually check that out, you can go into the link in your podcast app, click on that link, and it'll take you right to the collection that we just mentioned. where can people find you if they want to follow along, get in touch, and see what you do in the coming years?
Yeah, so I am embarrassingly super active on Twitter, and I can be found as the atheist nun. But not a long story on the name. And then I'm also starting an Instagram for the atheist nun in case Twitter ever actually does implode, which I think it'll be here till the end of time though with cockroaches. So, but yeah, please feel free to check out. I'm very interested in not only promoting my work, but I'm always trying to promote the work of other people who do similarly cool kind of queer, gender, early Christian, other religion stuff. So yeah, please feel free to visit.
Wonderful. Dr. Jeannie Sellick, thank you so much for being here. I had a blast.
Thanks.